The wind was a blade out here, slicing across the barren prairie like a judgment. Alara pulled the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, the threadbare wool offering little defense against the relentless November chill that clawed at the walls of the small, isolated cabin. Inside, the meager fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows that did little to dispel the gloom. Every gust outside seemed to whisper her name, a mournful echo of the life she had lost with Thomas 6 months ago. The silence within was a heavy shroud, broken only by the creak of the timbers and the endless moan of the wind. Loneliness was a physical ache, settling deep in her bones alongside the cold. She was ill-suited for this harsh existence, a townswoman plucked from gentle comforts and set down in a wilderness that seemed determined to devour her. Fear was her constant companion, a knot in her stomach that tightened with every sunset. The nearest neighbor was miles away, a family she barely knew and who viewed her with wary, distant eyes, perhaps pitying her, perhaps resenting her presence on land they saw as rightfully belonging to those more weathered by the unforgiving earth. She had little food left, fewer supplies. Survival felt like a cruel joke, a test she was failing day by day. Just yesterday, trying to fetch water from the half-frozen creek, her footing had slipped. She'd caught herself, but the shock had left her trembling. The simple task a terrifying reminder of her precarious grip on existence. It was a world of muted browns and grays, reflecting the state of her own spirit. Despair threatened to engulf her, a vast, empty ocean surrounding her small, fragile boat. She thought of packing up, abandoning the claim, fleeing back to the soft, forgiving east. But shame held her rooted. Shame and a stubborn, ember-like refusal to let this place, this grief, break her entirely. She would not crawl back defeated. Not yet. The thought was a small spark, easily extinguished by the overwhelming reality of her isolation and vulnerability. She was acutely aware of her limitations, her lack of strength, her ignorance of the ways of this land. Thomas had handled everything. Now there was only her, a woman alone in a world that seemed to have no place for her. She was turning from the window, the fading light outside mirroring the diminishing light within her, when a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing caught her eye. Against the backdrop of the dying day and the skeletal trees, a figure stood. Small, still. It wasn't a neighbor, not a traveler. It was too slight, too silent. A child? Impossible. No child would be out here alone in this weather. Her heart leaped into her throat, a sudden, sharp panic replacing the dull ache of despair. She froze, watching the figure. It didn't move, just remained on the threshold of the trees, a dark silhouette against the bruised sky. A wave of primal fear washed over her. Wild animals, drifters, unseen dangers the prairie held her mind conjured a dozen threats. But the figure remained small, unthreatening in its posture, yet terrifying in its very presence. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. It felt like a spirit, a harbinger of the darkness that was already closing in around her. She wanted to cry out, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. She could only stare, breath held captive in her chest, as the wind howled its indifferent, mournful tune outside. The cold seemed to deepen, seeping through the walls, through her clothes, settling deep within her soul. This was it, she thought. This was the end. The prairie had sent its final judgment. The figure remained for what felt like an eternity, a silent observer on the edge of her world. Finally, slowly, hesitantly, it moved. It was indeed a child, a boy. He was thin, clad in worn, unfamiliar buckskin. His dark hair plastered to his face by the wind and maybe something else, rain? Tears? He walked with a strange, uneven gait, favoring one leg. As he drew closer, she could see his face, a stark, angular face, solemn and smudged with dirt. But his eyes, dark and liquid, held a depth that was unsettling in one so young. He stopped a dozen yards from the cabin door, making no move to approach further, just standing there, shivering visibly, his gaze fixed on the cabin, on her. Fear warred with a flicker of something else within Alara, confusion, perhaps even a hesitant, buried spark of pity. He was just a boy. An Indian boy, clearly. Alone. Out here. The circumstances were beyond comprehension. Was he lost? Hurt? Fleeing something? The fear was still potent, a residual tremor in her limbs, but the immediate terror of the unknown figure had subsided, replaced by the bewildering reality of the small, vulnerable human standing before her. She wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing her cold arms, trying to think. What should she do? Her instincts screamed caution, warned her of unpredictable dangers, of societal judgment should she take in a native child. But the boy was clearly in distress. He looked utterly lost, utterly alone. Like her. The thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was as alone in his world as she was in hers. Their isolation met at the edge of her small clearing. Still, she hesitated. She had nothing to offer, barely enough to keep herself alive. Bringing him in would be a burden she couldn't afford, a complication she couldn't handle. And yet, she looked at his face again, the raw vulnerability in his eyes, and something deep within her, something buried beneath layers of grief and fear, stirred. It was the ghost of her own lost hope, perhaps, recognizing a reflection in his small, still form. After another long moment of silent, agonizing deliberation, during which the wind continued its mournful song and the light faded further, Elara finally moved. She didn't call out, didn't beckon. Dialogue felt too loud, too demanding in the vast silence. Instead, she simply reached out a hand, slowly, deliberately, towards the cabin door. She opened it wider, then stepped back, leaving the entrance open, an invitation hanging in the cold air. She watched him, her heart pounding, waiting for his reaction. The boy didn't move immediately. His dark eyes seemed to search hers, a long, silent appraisal. She held his gaze, trying to convey something other than fear, a quiet acknowledgement, a reluctant acceptance of his presence. Finally, with painstaking slowness, he took a step, then another. His injured leg dragged slightly. Each step was deliberate, a journey across the short distance that separated their two isolated worlds. When he reached the threshold, he stopped again, his hand hovering near the doorframe, hesitating. Elara remained still, giving him space, giving him agency in this strange, silent negotiation. He was perhaps 10 or 11 years old, she guessed, though hardship had etched lines that made him seem older. He was shivering uncontrollably now. The air inside the cabin felt marginally warmer than the cutting wind outside. After a final, searching look at her face, he dipped his head slightly, a gesture she couldn't quite read, and then, with a last hesitant step, he crossed the threshold and entered the cabin. Elara quietly closed the door behind him, shutting out the wind, shutting them both in, together, in the fragile sphere of light and warmth. The silence inside the cabin was now different. It was no longer just her silence, but a shared one, heavy with unspoken questions and the vast unknown of what had just transpired. She looked at the boy who stood just inside the door, his eyes taking in the meager interior, his small body trembling. She still didn't know his name, or where he had come from, or why he was here. But he was here, and for the first time in months, Elara wasn't entirely alone. The fear remained, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was now mingled with a profound uncertainty and a reluctant sense of responsibility that settled over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. He wouldn't speak, not a word. Elara tried. Gentle questions about his name, his family, where he'd come from. He simply looked at her with those deep, silent eyes, offering nothing. It was unnerving, yet strangely, it also felt like a boundary he was setting, a way of protecting himself. She respected it, wary herself of pushing too hard. She gave him water, watched him drink it slowly, deliberately. She offered the small amount of leftover stew she had, and he ate it with quiet, focused hunger, his movement sufficient despite his apparent weakness. His injured leg, she saw, was bruised and swollen near the ankle, likely a sprain or worse. She had little in the way of medical supplies, just a few clean rags and some liniment Thomas had used for aches. She knelt cautiously, gesturing towards his leg. He flinched slightly but didn't pull away. His gaze remained locked on her face, a mixture of wariness and something else she couldn't decipher. Slowly, carefully, she cleaned the dirt from the skin, her touch hesitant. The boy remained stoic, not making a sound, though she saw his jaw clench. She wrapped the injury snugly with strips of cloth, the rough linen scratchy against his skin. He watched her hands the entire time, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he simply nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement of his head. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement he had offered. She pointed to a corner near the hearth, where she had laid out an old quilt. He seemed to understand, moving stiffly to the spot and settling down, pulling the quilt around him. He didn't sleep, not for a long time. She could feel his eyes on her from across the room, even in the dim light. It was a silent, continuous observation. She did her chores, banked the fire, moved around the cabin, acutely aware of his presence, his gaze. The shared silence was no longer empty. It was filled with their mutual watchfulness, their unspoken questions, the hesitant dance of two strangers bound by circumstance. Over the next few days, a routine of sorts emerged, built on necessity and observation. He still didn't speak, but he began to move around the cabin more freely as his leg improved. He noticed things Alara missed. The way a draft snaked under the door, the knot in a loose floorboard, the faint scent of smoke when the chimney wasn't drawing properly. Without a word, he would address them. A small piece of wood shoved into the gap under the door, a rock wedged under the floorboard. He seemed to possess an innate understanding of the cabin's structure, of the practical needs of survival. He rarely met her eyes directly, but she often caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. His gaze was quiet, intelligent, assessing. She, in turn, watched him. She saw the quiet strength in his small body, the resilience etched onto his young face. She saw how he handled the few tools she had: a knife, a small saw, with a natural competence that surprised her. He wasn't a burden. He was a presence, a capable presence. Slowly, tentatively, the fear began to recede, replaced by a fragile sense of companionship. It wasn't a friendship, not yet, perhaps never. It was a mutual reliance, a shared understanding of the harsh world outside their door and the quiet sanctuary they were building within. One afternoon, as Alara struggled to split a piece of firewood that was too large for her axe, he came over. He took the axe from her hand without a word, his grip surprisingly firm. He adjusted the angle of the wood, swung the axe with a precise, economical movement, and split the log cleanly in two. He handed the axe back to her, his expression neutral. It was a small act, but it spoke volumes. It wasn't defiance or challenge, but simply competence offered where it was needed. Alara felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling that had nothing to do with the fire. It was gratitude, yes, but also a dawning recognition of his quiet strength, a strength that complemented her own fragile determination. They were two halves of a necessary whole, piecing together a life from the remnants of loss and the stark demands of the prairie. The silence between them was no longer a barrier, but a space they inhabited together, filled with unspoken communication and the slow, steady growth of trust. Their quiet existence, balanced precariously between the demands of survival and the fragile understanding that was forming between them, was bound to be tested. Word of the Indian boy staying with the widow spread quickly, carried on the wind like dust. In a community where difference was often met with suspicion, their arrangement was seen as unnatural, a transgression of unspoken rules. One cold afternoon, as Alara was banking the fire, a shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up to see Silas Croft standing there, his face grim, flanked by two other men from the scattered homesteads. Croft was a hard man, his eyes holding the same unforgiving glint as the winter sun. He didn't step inside, his posture one of judgment delivered from the threshold. "Alara," he said, his voice rough, devoid of warmth. "We need to talk about the boy." Alara's stomach clenched. She had expected this, dreaded it. Kalen, who had been whittling near the hearth, stopped, his small body tensing, though his face remained impassive. He understood more than they gave him credit for. He's just a child, Silas, Alara said, her voice steadier than she expected. He was alone, injured. Alone? Or hiding? Croft's eyes narrowed. Folks say he's Lakota. Could be trouble. They ain't peaceful folk. Not always. The casual cruelty of his words hung heavy in the air. He's hurt? Alara repeated, refusing to be drawn into his prejudice. He's harmed no one. He don't belong here. One of the other men muttered, shifting his weight. You know that, Alara. It ain't right. A white woman, alone, taking in a... He stopped, glancing at Kalen, then back at Alara, leaving the slur unspoken but loud in its absence. Alara felt a surge of protective anger, fierce and unexpected. This boy, this silent, capable child, had become more than just a presence. He was someone she had, in her quiet way, taken under her wing. He had shown her kindness through action, competence through necessity. He wasn't a threat. The real threat was the narrow-mindedness standing in her doorway. He is here, Alara stated, her voice gaining strength. And he stays. This is my home. Who I take in is my business. Croft took a step forward, his face darkening. Now see here, Alara. We're just looking out for you. And for the safety of the community. An Indian boy here. It attracts attention. Maybe unwanted attention. He gestured vaguely towards the west, towards the territories where skirmishes were rumored. He needs to go back where he came from. Kalen slowly stood up, moving closer to Alara, his dark eyes fixed on Croft. He said nothing, but his stance was one of quiet solidarity. Alara placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture both reassuring and defiant. He has no home, she said softly, but with unwavering conviction. He was orphaned. He told me it was a small lie. Kalen hadn't told her anything in words, but she felt the truth of it in her heart. He was adrift just as she had been. That don't make him your responsibility, Croft retorted, his patience wearing thin. He's Indian. Different. You can't trust him. I trust him more than I trust your judgment. Silas, Alara said, her voice sharp now. The words hung in the air, a direct challenge. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected a scared widow easily cowed. They found something harder, something forged in isolation and necessity. You're making a mistake, Croft warned, his voice low and menacing. There will be consequences. Alara met his gaze squarely, her chin lifted. Then I will face them. Now leave my home. There was a long, tense silence, broken only by the relentless wind outside. Croft stared at her, then at Kalen, who remained still and watchful beside her. The unspoken language between the boy and the woman, the quiet strength they seemed to draw from each other, was palpable. It was something the men, with their bluster and their prejudices, didn't understand. Finally, with a grunt of frustration, Croft turned away. This ain't over, he muttered, and with his companions, stomped back out into the cold, their footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. Alara watched them go, her heart still hammering, but the fear was different now. It was no longer paralyzing, but a fuel, a hot, defiant energy that coursed through her veins. She had stood her ground. Beside her, Kalen's small hand reached out and lightly touched her arm for a brief moment before withdrawing. It was a silent acknowledgement, a wordless thank you, and it meant more than any spoken gratitude could have. The threat remained, lingering on the horizon like a storm cloud, but facing it had solidified something vital between them. They were partners now, bound by the prejudice of the outside world and the quiet strength they found in each other. The immediate threat receded, but the tension in the air remained, a low thrum of potential conflict. The visit from Croft and the others had clarified their position in the eyes of the community. They were outsiders together. This shared exclusion, however, paradoxically deepened the bond between Alara and Kalen. It was them against the world, and in that realization, a quiet strength bloomed. Alara, who had once cowered at the thought of facing her neighbors, now felt a steely resolve. She had made a choice, a defiant one, and she would stand by it. She no longer saw herself merely as a grieving widow, adrift and vulnerable, but as a protector, a guardian of the small, fragile life she had taken in. Kalen, in turn, seemed to relax subtly after that day. While still mostly silent, his movements became less guarded, his presence in the cabin more settled. He continued to contribute in his quiet way, mending a loose hinge on the door, showing Alara which roots were edible in the late autumn ground, teaching her how to mend a tear in her cloak using a method she'd never seen. He watched her less with wary assessment and more with a quiet attentiveness, anticipating her needs before she voiced them. One evening, huddled by the fire, the wind whistling outside, Alara found herself speaking to him, not asking questions, but simply sharing. She spoke of Thomas, not the grief, but the simple memories, his quiet kindness, his love for the land, his hopes for their future on the claim. Kalen listened, his dark eyes fixed on the flames, offering no words, but his stillness, his quiet presence, was a profound form of listening. It was the first time she had spoken of Thomas without being crippled by sorrow. Sharing the memories with this silent boy felt like weaving a new thread into the fabric of her life, one that honored the past while reaching towards an uncertain future. In return, Kalen sometimes shared things in his own way. He would draw in the dirt with a stick, depicting hunting scenes, animals she recognized from the prairie, symbols she didn't understand but which spoke of a world outside her experience, a heritage he carried within him. He showed her constellations in the clear, cold night sky, pointing with a long, thin finger, his eyes alight with a knowledge ancient and deep. These were not just facts. They were fragments of his story, offered in a language beyond words. Alara learned to read his subtle cues, the slight shift of his weight, the tension in his shoulders, the direction of his gaze. She learned to trust his instincts about the weather, about the land. He learned her routines, her habits, her quiet moments of melancholy. They were a unit, forged not by blood or shared language, but by shared hardship and a mutual unspoken respect. The coming winter was harsh, testing their resilience daily. Snowdrifts piled high, the cold was a constant, gnawing adversary, and food became scarce. There were days when despair threatened to creep back in, but she would look at Kalen, tending the fire or sharpening a tool, his face etched with concentration, and she would find the strength to push on. He never complained, never showed fear, only a quiet determination that mirrored and reinforced her own. They survived because they worked together, each contributing their unique strengths to the shared goal. The boy's knowledge of the land and its ways, his quiet competence, complemented Alara's resourcefulness and stubborn will. She provided the fragile shelter and the remnants of a settled life. He brought the resilience of the wild places and a silent watchfulness that seemed to ward off unseen dangers. They were an unlikely pair, the widowed woman and the orphaned boy, bound by the vast, indifferent prairie that had stripped them bare and, in doing so, revealed the essential human need for connection, for belonging. Alara had come to this place broken and alone, fearing both the land and the people on it. She had found not only survival, but a quiet partnership, a connection that transcended words and background. Her vulnerability had not been a weakness, but a gateway to empathy, opening her heart to an unexpected bond. The silence that had once amplified her loneliness was now a comfortable space, filled with understanding. Kalen, displaced and silent, had found a fragile sanctuary, a person who saw past the surface and offered acceptance without judgment. Their lives, once solitary journeys towards uncertain ends, were now intertwined, moving forward together, two resilient figures standing against the vast horizon. Their bond a testament to the quiet power of human connection in the face of profound isolation and adversity. There was no grand pronouncement, no sudden transformation. It was a slow, steady unfolding, like the hesitant sunrise over the prairie, proving that even in the harshest landscapes, light and life could find a way to take root.